At 72, Margaret Whitfield was the kind of woman people pointed to as proof that life, when lived properly, rewarded you in the end. She lived in a white wooden house on a quiet American street where maple trees lined the sidewalks and neighbors waved without needing a reason. Every morning, she rose at the same hour, brewed her coffee the same way, and sat by the window where sunlight touched the lace curtains just enough to make the room feel gentle. Her hands moved slowly now, but with intention, shaped by decades of routine and responsibility. To the outside world, Margaret had won at life. She had been married for 51 years. She had raised children who called every Sunday. She had attended church faithfully, volunteered quietly, and never caused a ripple in the calm waters of her community. When people spoke about her, they used words like steady, graceful, fortunate. Margaret accepted those words with a polite smile, the kind that never revealed too much. What no one ever asked her was how it felt to live inside that admired life. In the evenings, when the house grew quiet and the walls seemed to listen, Margaret often sat in her armchair and stared at the family photographs lining the mantel. Weddings, birthdays, holidays frozen in time. Her husband stood beside her in most of them, tall and dependable, his arm resting lightly on her shoulder. He had always been kind, never cruel, never loud, never unfaithful, at least not in ways that could be proven. And yet, Margaret had lived with a strange, unspoken emptiness for as long as she could remember. It was the feeling of conversations that never quite went deep enough. Of questions she never asked because asking would disturb the peace she had worked so hard to maintain. She had learned early in her marriage that harmony was something you protected, even if it cost you parts of yourself. So she adapted. She listened more than she spoke. She forgave without explanation. She learned to call loneliness independence, and silence strength. Her friends envied her calm. Her children admired her resilience. But late at night, lying beside the man she had shared half a century with, Margaret often felt like a guest in her own life. There had been moments, small, fleeting moments, when she sensed something hidden beneath the surface. A hesitation in his voice. A story told without detail. Time he could never quite account for. Each time she pushed the thought away, convincing herself that trust meant not looking too closely. At her age, people said, digging into the past only brought regret. Margaret believed them. She wanted to. Yet that morning, as she stood alone in her living room, holding a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, she felt an unfamiliar restlessness settle into her bones. A quiet awareness that the life everyone admired might not be the life she truly understood. She didn't know it yet, but the balance she had preserved for decades was already shifting. And the truth, patient, persistent, and long overdue, was finally finding its way toward her.
Margaret had not planned to search for anything that morning. The day began like countless others, slow, predictable, and safe. After breakfast, she decided to tidy the hallway closet, a task she had postponed for years. It was the kind of chore she favored now, small and manageable, offering the comfort of order without demanding too much from her aging body. The closet smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. Winter coats hung untouched, their pockets holding forgotten gloves and old receipts. Margaret worked carefully, placing items in neat piles, pausing often to rest her knees and steady her breath. It was when she reached the bottom drawer that her routine faltered. The drawer resisted at first, swollen with age. When it finally slid open, it revealed a stack of yellowed folders, their edges curled and soft. Most were labeled in her husband's handwriting: insurance documents, warranty papers, tax records from decades past. She almost closed the drawer again. Then she noticed one folder without a label. It was thinner than the others, tucked beneath the stack as though it had been deliberately hidden. Margaret hesitated, her fingers hovering just above it. A quiet voice inside her urged her to leave it alone, to preserve the calm that had defined her life for so long. Instead, she pulled it free. Inside was a single piece of paper. No letter, no explanation, just a document folded carefully, its ink faded but legible. Margaret adjusted her glasses and read the heading twice before it registered. A birth record. Her heart gave a small, uncertain thud. The date was from more than 40 years ago. The location was a town she recognized only vaguely, somewhere her husband had once claimed to travel for work. The child's name meant nothing to her, but the father's name, typed clearly on the page, was unmistakable. Her husband's. Margaret lowered herself onto the hallway bench, the paper trembling in her hands. For a long moment, the house seemed to hold its breath with her. The clock continued ticking, oblivious, faithful as ever. She told herself there had to be an explanation. Men made mistakes on paperwork. Names could be similar. Records could be wrong. She had lived too long on certainty to let one document unravel everything. Still, a feeling she hadn't known in years crept in her chest, a mix of dread and clarity. Suddenly, memories rearranged themselves. Business trips that lasted just a little too long. Phone calls taken outside. A careful distance during certain seasons of their marriage, always explained away as stress or fatigue. Margaret had accepted those explanations without protest. She had believed that trust meant choosing not to question. Now, sitting alone with proof she couldn't dismiss, she wondered if trust had simply been the silence she'd learned to live with. She folded the document again, slower this time, and placed it back inside the folder. Her hands felt cold, unsteady. She returned the folder to the drawer, pushing it back into place as if hiding it might undo what she had seen. But the house felt different now. The walls no longer offered comfort. The familiar quiet pressed against her ears, heavy and watchful. Margaret realized that a single piece of paper had accomplished what decades of doubt never had. It had given shape to her unease. And once seen, the truth, however small it seemed, could not be unseen.
Margaret did not sleep that night. She lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned slowly, its soft hum marking the passage of time. The house felt unfamiliar, as though the walls had shifted while she wasn't looking. Beside her, her husband's side of the bed remained untouched, neatly made, a quiet reminder that his absence now carried more weight than it ever had before. The birth record rested in the hallway drawer, but it felt closer than that, pressed against her chest, heavy in her thoughts. By morning, Margaret realized the document had not introduced something new into her life. It had merely uncovered something she had worked hard to forget. As she moved through the day, memories began surfacing uninvited, each one small on its own, yet devastating in their accumulation. She remembered the year he started traveling more often. He had come home late one night, smelling faintly of a perfume she did not wear. When she asked about it, he laughed softly and blamed a crowded elevator. She had laughed too, relieved by the ease of the explanation, grateful for the excuse to let the question die. She remembered the phone calls he took on the porch. His voice lowered, his back turned. When she stepped outside once, he ended the call abruptly, telling her it had been a wrong number. She believed him because believing was simpler than imagining what doubt might demand of her. There was the summer he insisted they skip their anniversary trip. Work was complicated, he said. She swallowed her disappointment and told herself love was about patience, not insistence. That year she spent their anniversary alone, baking a cake she never served. At the time, none of it felt like betrayal. It felt like compromise. Margaret had been raised to believe that good women held families together by knowing when not to ask questions. Her mother had done the same. So had her grandmother. Silence, she had learned, was not weakness. It was endurance. And endurance earned respect. But now, with the birth record echoing in her mind, those moments returned with sharper edges. They no longer felt like misunderstandings. They felt like warnings she had carefully ignored. That afternoon, Margaret sat at the kitchen table and closed her eyes, allowing herself, perhaps for the first time, to imagine what might have been happening beyond her view. The thought made her chest tighten, not just because of the possibility of another woman or another life, but because of how willingly she had turned away from the truth. She realized she had buried those memories intentionally. Each time a doubt surfaced, she had pressed it down, covering it with routine, responsibility, and duty. She had convinced herself that peace was something you maintained by force, even if it meant surrendering your curiosity, your anger, your right to know. Opening those memories now felt like disturbing a grave. Yet, beneath the pain, Margaret sensed something unexpected, a quiet clarity. The past, once blurred by denial, was finally coming into focus. And with that focus came an unsettling realization. She had not been blind. She had been brave in the wrong way. As evening settled in and shadows stretched across the kitchen floor, Margaret understood that the life she had protected with silence was beginning to ask something of her. Not endurance, but honesty. By the fourth day after her discovery, Margaret understood that the truth did not arrive all at once. It surfaced slowly, like something long submerged finally rising for air. She began with small questions, harmless ones, the kind no one would suspect. While sorting through old photo albums, she paused at a picture taken decades earlier, during one of her husband's business trips. He stood in front of a motel sign, smiling stiffly, his suit jacket draped over one arm. "Do you remember where this was taken?" she asked him that evening, keeping her voice light. He barely glanced at the photo. "Somewhere in Ohio, I think," he said. All those towns blur together after a while. The answer should have satisfied her. Instead, it unsettled her. The birth record listed a town in Pennsylvania. Margaret nodded and said nothing. Over the next few days, she noticed how often his answers lacked detail. Dates were vague. Places shifted depending on how the question was framed. He spoke with the confidence of a man who had never been challenged, who assumed his past would remain unquestioned. Margaret realized how little she truly knew about the years that had shaped their marriage. She spent an afternoon in the spare bedroom, opening boxes she hadn't touched in years. Old calendars fell open to months filled with penciled notes, out of town, late meeting, conference. Entire stretches of time accounted for by a single phrase. She traced her finger over the entries, her heart steady but heavy. This was not proof, she told herself. It was context. Still, context mattered. That evening, she brought up the folder. Not the document itself, just the drawer. "I found some old papers in the hallway closet," she said as they sat across from each other at dinner. "I didn't recognize all of them." He stiffened for just a moment. So brief she might have missed it if she hadn't been watching. "Probably nothing important," he replied. "I kept everything back then. Habit." Margaret studied his face. After 51 years, she knew the subtle signs. The way his jaw tightened when he felt cornered, the careful neutrality in his voice when he chose not to elaborate. She felt a strange calm settle over her. The truth, she realized, was not hidden because it was well protected. It was hidden because she had never tried to uncover it. Later that night, she stood alone in the living room, surrounded by evidence of a shared life. Furniture chosen together, memories carefully preserved, silence carefully maintained. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine that two versions of her marriage existed. The one she lived and the one she had never been allowed to see. Neither erased the other. But one had been incomplete. As Margaret turned off the lights and prepared for bed, she understood something fundamental had shifted. The truth no longer felt like an enemy. It felt inevitable. And once a lifelong question finally found its voice, there was no returning to the comfort of not knowing. Margaret did not set out to find her. At first, she told herself she only wanted clarity, something to settle her thoughts, something to help her sleep again. The name on the birth record had lingered in her mind for days, hovering just beyond her courage. Saying it aloud felt dangerous, as though it might turn possibility into fact. On a quiet afternoon, with rain tapping softly against the windows, she finally typed the name into her computer. The search took less than a minute. There was a photograph. A face older now, framed by gray-streaked hair and tired eyes. Not beautiful in the way youth promises, but real in a way that unsettled Margaret. This woman had lived a life. Perhaps one shaped by the same man, in ways Margaret had never known. Her name was Eleanor. Margaret stared at the screen longer than she meant to. Eleanor's expression was neither proud nor ashamed. It was cautious, as though she had learned long ago not to expect understanding from the world. The address listed beneath the photo was less than an hour away. Margaret closed the laptop. She told herself distance didn't matter. Time had passed. Whatever had happened belonged to another lifetime. Yet her heart beat faster as the idea of meeting Eleanor took shape, not as confrontation but as recognition. 2 days later, Margaret found herself standing outside a modest apartment building. Her hands folded tightly around her purse. The neighborhood was quiet, unremarkable. Children's bicycles leaned against fences. Wind chimes chimed softly in the distance. This was not the setting of scandal or drama. It was the setting of survival. When the door opened, Eleanor looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "I wondered if this day would come," she said quietly. Margaret swallowed. "I didn't know what to say." Eleanor stepped aside without hesitation. "You don't have to say anything. Just come in." The apartment was small but carefully kept. Framed photos lined the walls. Graduations, birthdays, ordinary milestones. A life lived without spectacle. They sat across from each other at a small kitchen table. 2 women bound by decades of silence. "I never wanted to hurt you," Eleanor said, her voice steady but soft. "I didn't know how to exist without the truth hurting someone." Margaret listened, her hands resting calmly in her lap. There was anger inside her, yes, but also something else. A recognition that whatever choices had been made, they had been carried alone by both of them. Eleanor spoke of promises never kept, of a child raised quietly, of years spent waiting for a man who never fully belonged to either of them. When Eleanor finished, the room felt heavier, but clearer. Margaret stood to leave, her legs unsteady but her resolve firm. At the door she paused. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I needed to know." As she stepped back into the rain, Margaret understood the truth had finally taken a face. And once seen, it could no longer be denied. Margaret drove home in silence, the windshield wipers moving in a slow, steady rhythm that matched her breathing. The rain had eased, but the weight in her chest had not. Eleanor's words echoed in her mind, not as accusations, but as facts delivered without cruelty. There had been no grand betrayal scene, no dramatic confession, just 2 women sharing the truth that had shaped their lives in different ways. When Margaret reached her house, she sat in the car for several minutes before turning off the engine. The familiar structure looked unchanged. White siding, trimmed hedges, the porch light glowing warmly in the early evening. Yet she knew something fundamental had shifted. The marriage she had believed in for 51 years could no longer remain intact in its old form. Inside, the house smelled faintly of dinner. Her husband was in the kitchen, reading the paper as if nothing in the world required his attention. The ordinariness of the moment felt almost unbearable. She didn't confront him right away. Instead, Margaret watched him. How he folded the paper, how he avoided her eyes, how comfortably he occupied a life built on omission. For the first time, she saw her marriage not as a shared truth, but as a carefully edited story. That night, lying awake beside him, Margaret reviewed her life as if rewriting a book she had read too many times. She saw the early years clearly now. The affection, the partnership, the shared dreams. Those memories remained real. Love had existed. It still did, in some quiet, altered form. But love, she realized, was not the same as honesty. Over the following days, Margaret stopped protecting the past. She reread old letters, re-examined photographs, and allowed herself to interpret them differently. Each piece fell into place, not with shock, but with a painful coherence. Her husband had lived 2 lives, not recklessly, not cruelly, but deliberately. He had chosen silence as a strategy, assuming time would bury his mistakes. And Margaret had unknowingly helped him by asking nothing. This understanding did not erase her years of devotion. It reframed them. Margaret began to see herself not as foolish, but as faithful in a way that had cost her deeply. She had given loyalty without conditions, patience without demand, trust without verification. Now, at 72, she recognized that endurance alone was not a virtue. One evening, as they sat across from each other in the living room, Margaret finally spoke. "I met someone today," she said calmly. His eyes flickered. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She simply allowed the truth to exist between them, unguarded. In that moment, the marriage they had shared quietly unraveled, and rewrote itself, not as a lie, but as a story that had finally reached its honest chapter. Margaret did not expect the anger to come so late. For days after she spoke those careful words, "I met someone today," she moved through the house as if suspended between two lives. Her husband grew quieter, his presence heavy with unasked questions. He did not deny. He did not explain. His silence, once familiar, now felt like an admission. And that was when the anger arrived. Not sudden, not explosive. It crept in during ordinary moments. While washing dishes, Margaret felt her hands begin to shake. While folding laundry, she caught herself gripping the fabric too tightly. It was a slow-burning fury, sharpened by years of restraint. She was angry at him, for the choices he made, for the truth he withheld, for the life he shaped without her consent. But she was also angry at herself, for believing peace was worth the cost, for mistaking endurance for love, for carrying the weight of silence as though it were her duty alone. Grief followed close behind. Margaret grieved the marriage she thought she had, the woman she might have been had she asked harder questions, the decades she spent protecting a version of life that protected no one in return. It was not just grief for betrayal, it was grief for time. Time did not wait. It did not return what it took. One evening, overwhelmed by the weight of it all, Margaret sat alone in the living room and cried. Not quietly, not politely, but deeply, the way she hadn't allowed herself to cry in years. The tears came without words, releasing emotions she had stored carefully for half a century. Her husband stood in the doorway, uncertain. "I never meant to hurt you," he said at last. The words landed hollow. Intent, Margaret realized, did not erase impact. That night, she understood she stood at a crossroads. At 72, walking away felt unimaginable. Leaving would mean dismantling a life built on shared routines, shared memories, shared names. Staying meant accepting a truth she could no longer ignore. For the first time, Margaret allowed herself to consider what she wanted. Not what was expected. Not what preserved appearances. But what honored her remaining years. She realized the choice before her was not between staying or leaving. It was between continuing to disappear or finally being seen. The anger clarified her boundaries. The grief softened her judgment. And in that balance, Margaret made a decision. Not impulsive, not cruel, but resolute. Whatever came next, it would be built on truth. Silence would no longer be her offering. At last, she was choosing herself. The conversation did not happen right away. Margaret needed time, not to calm down but to steady herself. Anger could speak loudly, but she wanted her words to land with clarity, not chaos. She waited until an evening when the house was quiet, when there were no distractions left to hide behind. They sat at the kitchen table, the same place where countless ordinary conversations had taken place. Grocery lists, doctor's appointments, polite observations about the weather. This time, the air felt heavier, charged with everything that had gone unsaid. "I know about her," Margaret said simply. Her husband did not pretend to misunderstand. He looked down at his hands, aged and familiar. Hands that had built a life with her and dismantled parts of it without her knowing. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he nodded. "She never meant to disrupt our life," he said quietly. "I thought I could keep it contained." Margaret felt the words strike something deep within her. Contained. As if a life, a child, decades of secrecy could be reduced to a manageable inconvenience. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she asked the questions she had buried for years. "How long? Did you love her? Did you ever plan to tell me?" Each question was measured, deliberate. Each answer arrived slower than the last. He spoke of loneliness he never admitted, of fear, of a decision made once and sustained through avoidance. He spoke as though explaining weather patterns, Unpredictable, unfortunate, but beyond his control. Margaret listened not to excuse him, but to understand the full shape of the truth. When he finished, silence filled the room. "I gave you 51 years, she said at last. Not because I was afraid of being alone, but because I believed in what we were building." Her voice did not tremble. "I didn't consent to sharing my marriage. I consented to trusting you." Tears welled in his eyes then. Real ones. "Too late." "I don't know what you want me to do," he whispered. Margaret realized she didn't either. Not yet. But she knew what she would no longer accept. "I want honesty," she said. "Even if it costs us the comfort we've been hiding behind." The conversation did not end with forgiveness or resolution. It ended with truth standing plainly between them, exposed, irreversible, and necessary. That night, as Margaret lay awake, she felt something unfamiliar. Relief. Because the weight of not knowing had finally been lifted. And whatever came next, it would not be built on lies. In the days that followed the conversation, Margaret noticed a quiet change within herself. The house was the same. The routines remained. Her husband moved through the rooms more carefully now, as though afraid of disturbing something fragile. But Margaret no longer felt fragile. She felt awake. For the first time in years, she began to notice her own thoughts before silencing them. She took longer walks in the mornings, choosing different streets simply because she could. She sat on park benches and watched strangers pass, wondering about the lives they had chosen, and the ones they had abandoned. There was a strange freedom in realizing she was no longer obligated to protect a version of herself that no longer fit. At 72, the world did not expect reinvention from her. That made it easier. Margaret began writing again, something she had stopped doing decades earlier. At first, the words came slowly, short reflections scribbled into a notebook she found tucked away in a drawer. Then they grew steadier. She wrote about the girl she had been before marriage, the woman she became inside it, and the person she was now becoming beyond it. She did not write to accuse. She wrote to remember herself. There were moments of doubt, of course. Late at night, she wondered if she was foolish for questioning a life so late. If reclaiming herself now was simply another form of regret. Society was quick to praise endurance, slow to celebrate awakening. But each time the doubt crept in, Margaret returned to one truth. It was not too late to be honest with herself. She met Eleanor once more, not to reopen wounds but to close them. They spoke gently, without bitterness. Two women acknowledging that survival sometimes demands choices no one is proud of. Margaret left that meeting feeling lighter, not because the past had changed, but because it no longer controlled her. Her relationship with her husband shifted into something uncharted. There were boundaries now. Hard ones. Necessary ones. Love, if it remained, would have to learn a new language. One spoken in truth, not habit. Margaret understood that finding herself did not require dramatic exits or loud declarations. It required permission. Permission to want more than peace at any cost. Permission to speak without apology. Permission to live honestly, even if honesty arrived late. One afternoon, standing at her bedroom mirror, Margaret studied her reflection. The lines on her face told a story of patience, loss, and quiet strength. She smiled, not with sadness but with recognition. Perhaps she had arrived late to herself. Or perhaps she had arrived exactly when she was ready. Either way, she was here now. And that was enough. Margaret did not announce her decision. There was no dramatic moment, no raised voices or slammed doors. The ending of her story unfolded the way her life always had. Quietly, deliberately, with intention. But this time the silence was chosen, not endured. She and her husband sat together one final evening at the kitchen table, the space where truths had finally been spoken. The light above them hummed softly. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its familiar calm. "I'm not leaving because I hate you," Margaret said gently. "I'm leaving because I finally understand myself." He listened without interrupting, his shoulders heavy with a realization he could no longer escape. There were apologies, Many of them. Some sincere. Some too late. Margaret accepted none and rejected none. Apologies, she had learned, were not the same as repair. They agreed on something simple: respect. The house would be sold. Separate spaces found. Their children would be told the truth. Not the details, but the honesty that mattered. Margaret felt no shame in it. Only clarity. In the weeks that followed, she moved into a small apartment overlooking a park. The rooms were modest, the furniture minimal. For the first time in decades, every object belonged solely to her. She planted herbs on the windowsill. She walked without explaining where she was going. She slept deeply, unburdened by the need to maintain appearances. Sometimes grief visited her. It came quietly like an old friend, reminding her of shared laughter, long years, and moments that had once been real and good. She welcomed it without letting it define her. More often, peace arrived. Margaret volunteered at the local library, reading to children and helping others find stories they didn't know they were searching for. She smiled more easily now, not out of politeness but contentment. One afternoon, a woman asked her if it was frightening to start over so late in life. Margaret considered the question carefully. "What frightened me," she replied, "was staying silent forever." At 72, she did not claim happiness as a reward. She claimed honesty as a right. Her ending was not loud enough for headlines. But it was brave. And in that bravery, Margaret found something she had spent a lifetime postponing. A life that finally belonged to her.